Well, shall we get started?
Whenever you're ready.
Whenever I'm ready. Okay. So I will say welcome to everybody. Thanks for being with us. Continuing in this exploration that we fondly called the how, what, why, when, where, some background material on all of the fundamental components of Jewish life, texts, the life cycle, the holiday cycle, and we're just continuing on through. We've gotten through an introduction to Torah, the Torah, speaking in terms of the what we call the Sefer Torah in Hebrew, which translates as a book, but it's also in the scroll form, the way that we have it. Certainly the 5 books of Moses, sometimes also referred to in Hebrew as a chumash, which comes from the word that means for 5, so the 5 books of Moses. You might have heard it as the Pentateuch, that way. So we talked about Torah in the specific sense, referring to the first of the 3 parts of the Hebrew Bible, known as the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, for the T sound for the Taf of Torah, the Nun, the N for Nevi'im, referring to the prophets, and then the Ch, or actually, when it becomes the first letter of the word, Ketuvim is the holy writings, the Psalms, Proverbs, Chronicles, and the separate scrolls like Esther and Ecclesiastes and Lamentations, and things like that. Ruth, which we just read on Shavuot. We're focusing specifically on understanding Torah, the Torah text, and what it means for Torah in the general sense of all of Jewish learning. So one leads to the other. Indeed, there are some who would say that any statement that's made specific, trying to give authenticity to a Jewish position, thinking, policy, practice, whatever, that it really doesn't have validity unless you can somehow prove it. And we'll talk a little bit more what that means, but unless you can somehow prove it from Torah. Torah specifically meaning the 5 books of Moses, or Torah meaning the collection of Jewish sacred literature. We'll try to put those that kind of framework. Our friend, at least he's in the middle of my screen right now, Dr. Steve Marin, is fond of telling all the students that there's a principle in understanding Torah, whether it's the text of the 5 books of Moses, or whether it's pretty much anything in Jewish sacred literature, and that's that there's no present and there's no past and there's no future in trying to understand a specific text the way it may have been written. That's a paraphrase of a quotation from the Talmud, and if you don't know what the Talmud is, we'll get there probably next week. But that's something to always keep in mind, that on the one hand, if you're trying to specifically look at a sentence or a verse or a particular reference in the Bible, in the Hebrew, there's not only the very, very strange rules of biblical Hebrew, biblical grammar, that can be very, very confusing as to understanding the particular tense of whether a verb is in the past tense or the future tense and how it should be understood. But there's also the reality that because of something that I'm going to be talking about in a few minutes, we can't necessarily give credence to the Bible as strictly a chronology or a history text. Sometimes there are things that are in the Bible that are placed there that we just know could not have happened in that particular sequence. It must have happened, or there's a reference to something that would have happened either hundreds of years later or hundreds of years or at least decades earlier. So when you're looking at the teaching or the lessons that can be derived from a text in the Bible, and especially in the Torah, you always have to remember this overlying statement that there's really no past, there's no present, there's no future in the way that you read the particular text, so it doesn't lead to confusion. Okay. So again, that reminds us that yes, there are differences. There's tremendous differences between the biblical grammar and modern Hebrew grammar. There were thousands of years in between when Hebrew was not a spoken language. And when it was indeed resurrected, if I can use that term, and reestablished as a spoken language, influenced by Romance languages and European languages, and then languages of the Middle East, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. For there's no biblical Hebrew word for televisia, but now that's the modern Hebrew word. Okay, so but similarly, or the opposite, the converse is that there are words in the Torah or in the Bible that halchu le'ibud, as we say, that they became extinct, that we don't know exactly what they meant. We can only try to surmise what they may have meant in context, whether it's the noun of a particular plant or a particular species of animal, or whether it's a particular place, or whether it's the way that our ancestors understood a unit of measurement, or whatever it might have been. It's possible that we're totally misunderstanding what the word might have been. So there are those changes in the Hebrew language, especially. There are ways that the language may have been misused. There's certainly mistranslations that have affected the way that we look at a text. But for Jewish history and for the scholars of Jewish history and Jewish literature, they just didn't have a problem if there was an inconsistency or if there was something that didn't make sense. If all of a sudden a verb in the middle of a monologue that one individual, and there are very few times really when there's conversation in the Torah or in the Tanakh, in the Bible, when there's conversation between more than two people. I mean, there are times when Moses or the prophet or whomever addresses a large crowd. There are fewer times when God addresses the entire people, but usually there are only one or two or three people involved in a particular conversation at all once. But there are inconsistencies. So I started to say, in the middle of a monologue, all of a sudden, where God is speaking or Moses is speaking, or and any individual is speaking, Aaron is speaking, and all of a sudden the grammar changes from singular to plural. Prime example. If you go back to the story of creation, and God is creating the world, right? And then all of a sudden, on the sixth day, God said, "Let us create human beings in our image." Well, wait a minute. Why of all of a sudden is it in the plural? God is the only one who's speaking. Who's God speaking about? Who's the us? Who's the we? Now, certainly we can add our own understanding of that, our own interpretation, but it's an inconsistency. my point is that it didn't, for generations, it didn't bother. It wasn't a source of conflict for our ancestors and for the sages and for the rabbis and the teachers. They used an inconsistency that they might see, or a repetition. And again, I'll talk about some of these things, that they used a repetition, and they used it to kind of challenge their imaginations. So that, well, who might God? Was God speaking to the angels? Was God speaking to and asking permission from all of the other creations beforehand? Is it okay if we create, and you're partners with me in this process of creating humanity, whatever? How, and again, rather than being concerned about an inconsistency in the grammar or in the timetable, whatever, the rabbis and the scholars and the sages saw it as an opportunity to try to better understand what was actually happening. Ultimately, they came to, just like, again, I was mentioning this underlying statement that there's no present, past, or future. Ultimately, they came to a simple statement, is that this is God's doing. We are human. By definition, we are not divine beings. Therefore, we don't really understand. We can speculate, we can teach, we can try to glean from the story, but we don't really understand. We don't really know what God's plan was, or why this particular wording was chosen. Remember that they all believed that God gave the Torah to Moses verbatim, word for word. And so God must have had a reason for saying it this way, or for handing on the quote this particular way. And since we're not divine, we can't really understand. We're given permission to question, but we can't really understand. The only one who could was Moses, and we may get to that when we talk about Maimonides. So for centuries, the way that our people understood the Torah was specifically as a gift from God. And we just celebrated Shavuot, the festival that commemorated God giving the Torah to Moses, and then the transmission of Torah from Moses to Joshua to the elders of the people, on down through history, until the establishment of the institution called rabbis. And the rabbis then took on the holy task of teaching Torah, which continues on to the Zoom experience we're celebrating and sharing today in the 21st century. Who would have expected? Okay. Already as of the mid 18th century, scholars, not so much Jewish necessarily, but they had to understand Jewish, and by that I mean the Hebrew text. So scholars start to look at the text and question why the Tanakh, why the Hebrew scriptures, and they were doing the same for New Testament, but we're focusing on what they call the Old Testament, or on the Hebrew Bible, of why it appears in the form that it appears now. And they wanted to try to resolve, rather than just excuse, some of these inconsistencies or some of these mistakes. So it's the development of what in biblical scholarship, what's called source theory. So what is the source really of the Torah? If we're going to reject the traditional framework that God gave the Torah, or God narrated the Torah and Moses wrote it down, except for the last paragraph, because the last paragraph takes place after, or the last couple of sentences takes place after Moses dies. So he wouldn't have been able to serve as the scribe writing it down after his death. But if that was the traditional understanding that God either dictated or gave the written Torah to Moses or inspired Moses to write it one way or the other. But as of the middle of the 18th century, scholars started to talk in terms of what they called source theory. Actually began in France, but the more familiar way of looking at source theory actually is early in the 19th century, coming out of two or three different schools of thought. The one that is specifically within the Jewish world was called, here's why I can impress you with my German skills, right? The Wissenschaft des Judentums. It was the scientific study of Judaism that was built on the critical analysis of the biblical literature by a Protestant minister named Wellhausen. And Wellhausen talked in terms of that it was easy to identify, or maybe easy for him today, where there's a lot of argument about it, but it was easy to identify four separate sources, four separate, whatever you want to call them, schools of thought, four separate editors. Now, they don't mean just one individual, but an editorial board, I guess, an editorial committee is what they would think of it. Each with a particular agenda, and in literary terms, I would use the phrase, each of those editorial committees had its own bias. Now, we're not going to get into a whole thing about fake news and what's going on in our world today, but let's keep it within the structure of understanding the Bible, understanding the Torah, especially. Wellhausen and his students, his disciples, went through the text, the Hebrew text, and easily identified. It was easy for them, like I say, not so easy for us today, but easily identified four, and some of the disciples said actually five, but more of them accepted four separate editorial committees, like I say, editors or schools of thought, ranging from the 9th, 8th, 7th, and 6th centuries BCE, okay, of when the Torah, which was originally an oral document, it was handed down or conveyed orally by one storyteller, one parent, grandparent to the children in whatever way, someone speaking in the marketplace. We talked about that last week, in the marketplace, and whoever was there, to hear it. And so beginning in approximately the 9th century, actually, there's what they call the J source, and then the 8th century, the E source, and then the 7th century, the D source, and the 6th century, the P source, all before the Common Era. They identified those particular letters. They're based on a not an Englishizing, but a Germanizing of the Hebrew words. So the J source for them was the source that used, and just oversimplifying, but that used the Hebrew term that some people pronounce as Jehovah or Yahweh or something like that, the four-letter name for God. In Hebrew, it's Yud He Vav He, but frequently, I guess, as with Spanish, is that the Yud sound, the Y sound, is written with a J. So they started with all of the parts of the Torah, parts of the Bible, where God is referred to either in God's own words or by the narrator, with the four-letter name for God that begins with J, again in German or in English, and they said, okay, that reflects the agenda or the particular literary bias, which means God concept of history, and the way that this individual or the editorial committee, the way that they had assimilated and accumulated all of the stories from Jewish history. So those were collected as the J source. Within 100 years afterwards, then there must have been another narrator, another storyteller, another editorial committee that could be identified as those with those quotations or those paragraphs where God is referred to with a name that many of us relate to, Elohim or Eloheinu, our God. And so they identified those, and they've made that the E for Elohim, if you will. 100 years later, another editorial committee went through all of the literature as they had it, that was written down and that had been transmitted orally, and they identified specifically those passages that were historiography. That's everything from just talking where you find those chapters, and again, the people from the Torah study class will know what I'm talking about, specifically those chapters that talk about, and here's a list of the 20 oases that the children of Israel stopped to as they marched from this place to this place, and giving all of the names of all of the places and all of the genealogies, and this person begot this person, who begat this person, begot this person, and this person was the uncle of so-and-so, and this person was the nephew, and this person, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's all part of the D source in the first four books of the Bible, of the Torah, and then almost exclusively the D source is the fifth book of the Torah, Deuteronomy, which, if you think of it, or if you know a little bit of the Greek or whatever, deutero means a repeating, a second time, and so Deuteronomy is kind of a repetition. It's the historian's review of everything that had happened, or at least what that editorial committee felt was important that we recall from the first four books. There's not much that refers to Genesis. It actually starts with referring with Exodus, and they put it in the context of this is Moses's farewell sermon. No, Moses knows that he's not going to cross over the Jordan River. He's saying goodbye to the people. He talks about asking God to let him cross the Jordan. God says, no, your job is just to bring them to the end. And this is what happens. So it's a review, if you will. Indeed, Jewish tradition or rabbinic tradition refers to the last book of the Torah as Mishneh Torah, as a repeating of the Torah or a revision of the Torah, if you will. Then the fourth of those main sources, as written by Wellhausen and his school of thought, is what they call the P source. P actually standing for priestly. So if you go back into the entire there's not much in Deuteronomy, but mostly the four of the 5 books of the Torah, and you identify those verses or those sections, including the entire book of Leviticus, or almost the entire book of Leviticus, where the priests, the Kohanim, and the Leviim, the Levites, where it's almost like it's power struggle between Moses on the one hand and Aaron on the other hand, and who comes out on top as they're trying to establish a new society, a free society. Is it going to be a religious, spiritual cult, so to speak, or is it going to be a democratic society, so to speak? Is it going to be a place where sacrifice and worshiping God is most important? Is it going to be a people, and once they reach the promised land, are they going to have a monarchy? And exactly, and how will the judicial system be structured? And you can see the tension between those who follow Moses's teaching and those who want to see Aaron and his sons and the Levites as being in charge. Again, some other time we'll have a discussion as to how that plays out in the Middle East and even in the state of Israel today. But those are some of the oversimplified ways of the way that biblical scholarship, certainly since the 1700s, have started to look at this as a human document rather than as the specific what we would say Torah Sinai, that the Bible was given by God specifically to Moses, to the Jewish people, for the role that we will play in the world. How do we? I don't want to say how do we know that this is the case, but if you need any kind of insight into how this plays out, I'll just mention a couple of them. And again, I'm certainly not indicating or implying that everyone has to accept this what they call the documentary hypothesis, that the Torah is, and indeed the entire Tanakh, the entire Bible, is an anthology and a collection of lots of different stories and whatever. You're welcome to accept that, understand it that way, or you're welcome to not. But I wanted to present it to you. And if you needed some further examples to think about, so just I'd throw a couple of them out to you. The book of Genesis talks about where we came from, at least within the religious context, not scientific, but within the religious context. But as you might know, there's more than one story there, and indeed, over the centuries, the two stories kind of get mixed up, but they have two totally different ways of understanding the process of creation. Genesis chapter 1 talks about God creating the heaven and the earth out of nothing, ex nihilo, out of nothing but darkness and chaos, and then God created order, and the order continues over a progression of 6 days, starting heaven and earth and the waters, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and then the great lights in the sky, and we move on until on the sixth day. Oh, and then incidentally, along the way, God sees that this is good. There's evening, there's morning of a first day, second day, third day. We finally get to the sixth day, and at the end of the sixth day, God creates, and I said, is it in the singular, in the plural, whatever, but God creates human beings, Adam, Zachar Unekeva bara otam, male and female creator were created, boom, in one moment, if you will. Excuse me. And then God saw that not only everything was good, but everything was tov me'od, everything was very good. And there was evening and there was morning of the sixth day, and now God could rest. And now we have the Shabbat, God could rest, and God identified the sixth day and sanctified it and made it a commandment for us to follow as well. And there's the story of creation. evolution, even if you will, of going from one day to the next day to the next day, and things become more advanced in the different species until finally, ideally, human beings, male and female, created at the same time, in the same breath. That's the story as it was collected and put into the Torah, or added into the Torah, from the E source, right? Bereshit bara Elohim. In the beginning, God created. That's our E source. But there are other stories, there are other sources, whether they're scientifically based or not, leave that up to you. But there are other stories of how the world came into being, not over 6 days necessarily, but just like in the first story, man and woman were created together. In the second story, in chapter 2, the entire world is created in one thing. Call it Big Bang if you want. The Torah doesn't refer to it that way, but obviously there were those who thought of, I was going to say conceived, but that's a different interpretation. That the world was created at one moment. Everything already existed. Then it's just a matter of God identifying names and God clarifying the roles of different species. But I just made a mistake, because it's not God who is the main character in this particular story. It might be the J source, or some would say it's actually the J-E source. It's a combination text, whatever. It's the Adonai. It's the 4-letter name for God, who's the main subject and the creator in that story. God doesn't create male and female together. I shouldn't say God. It's the Lord, or Adonai, Yahweh, doesn't create male and female together in the next story. The next story has Adam being created, and then after all the other species are given their particular roles to play, Adam says, how come I'm all alone? Everyone else seems to have a partner. And the Lord says, okay, go to sleep, Adam. Time to do this surgery and anesthesia. And Adam goes to sleep, and God takes a rib out of Adam's side and creates a helpmate, a woman who is the source of life, and gives her the name of Eve, etc. And it's an entirely different story. An entirely different story. The ancients weren't bothered by the inconsistencies of those two different stories. They saw them as complementing each other. They understood that they were different attempts by humans or by the storyteller to relate and have a story, have a narrative that would resonate with the particular audience. I mentioned before, the different narrators had their own bias. I don't mean that in a negative sense. I mean that in a positive sense. Their own bias in understanding how they wanted the story to be told, to be heard, and what the lessons might be. Obviously, the feminists, to the extent that there were feminists thousands of years ago, but the feminists would not have preferred the second story. They would have preferred the first story, and yet both had validity in that sense. Or here's another example, and again, the opportunity will come for us to study it actually fairly soon in the Torah study class on Saturday morning. So there's a further plug and invitation for people to join. So chapter 22 of Genesis is the familiar Akedah story, the sacrifice or the binding of Isaac. God, according to the text, and it's an source. It's that God is the one who appears to Abraham in the middle of the night and says, "Take your son, your only son, and take him up to the top of the mountain, and we're gonna have a sacrifice at the top of the mountain." And again, there's all kinds of, and hopefully in a week or two we'll have the opportunity on Saturday morning to explore really what was going on here. But for the point of or for the point that I wish to make now, so it's the God source, it's the source that sets the stage, tells the story. Has Abraham takes Isaac, they're walking up the side of the mountain, get to the top of the mountain. Abraham binds, that's the Hebrew word, binds Isaac on the altar, and he has the knife, and he's ready to slay his son as part of this test. The story begins that it happens after these things that God created a test for Abraham, is one way of translating the Hebrew, that God tested Abraham. And so Abraham's ready to bring the knife down and slay his son, and all of a sudden a voice stops him. Has to call to him twice, incidentally. Abraham, what are you doing? You don't do that. Who's speaking? Who stops Abraham? Not God's voice, but an angel of the Lord, an angel of Yahweh or Jehovah. It's almost like there's this tension between two storytellers. Well, which is it? Should Abraham fulfill the test of faithfulness, or do we want the Israelites to know that our people don't believe in human sacrifice? And for generations, there's been in the interpretive literature, there's been this tension of, well, what's the lesson that we're supposed to learn from this story? Incidentally, Isaac never speaks to his father again, but again, we'll leave that to the psychologists and the psychotherapists to deal with that. But is the story the way that we have it? It has been the two different narrators, the two different storytellers. It's as if we have the lead-in to the story being told by the New York Times, and then the end of the story being told by the Wall Street Journal, with different ways of understanding. And what's the lesson that we want our people or the readers or the listeners to remember about this story, this particular episode? So that's just an indication of, in addition to the rabbinic way of interpreting Torah, and that's where we're headed next, there's also the biblical scholarship that parallels it. That's and I don't mean to imply that it's non-religious, that it's a secular way, but biblical scholarship that's more literary analysis, if you will, certainly has existed since the 18th century. More importantly, in more modern terms, into the 19th century. It parallels the development of Reform Judaism, and then Reform Judaism has a break off into Conservative Judaism, and then Reconstructionist Judaism, and whatever. And they all have to have their separate responses to the way that scholarship has approached the sacred literature. If I had to summarize what modern scholarship talks about, it's not that they've rejected the documentary hypothesis, like Wellhausen and others that followed him, but now most biblical scholarship, with the exclusion of perhaps the Biblical Archaeology Review, but most biblical scholarship today talks in terms not of JEPD, but they talk in terms of what they call the big R's, not for Roman and not for rabbi, but for what they call the redactors. There's a redactor number 1, redactor number 2, redactor number 3. And again, think of the editors or the editorial committee of the publishing house that's saying, well, yes, we can put it in this way, but no, we can't put it. We can't put it in this way. Those different redactors. Again, we're not talking of modern. We're talking of centuries ago. That they were affected by their particular geography, by the particular genealogy of who they thought were the more important characters, and if they wanted to make a connection for whether they felt there's a big one of the redactors. I saw an article a couple of weeks ago of those that feel that basically Judaism was open and welcoming to the stranger, being evangelical, if you will, and others are saying no, it's a closed group, and we're going to do as much as we possibly can to identify those who are who actually convert and join the people, as opposed to those who are the resident aliens, and there's one set of laws for them as opposed to those who have accepted the covenant, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So you see how that works. Okay, when we're looking at the Torah text, no matter who wrote it, no matter how it was collected, there are certain things that we can find great meaning, pleasure, inspiration in looking at these, and they help us understand. And again, those of you who are involved in the Saturday morning study group, some of you will recognize some of the things that I'm talking about. Certainly, the Torah text and the entire Tanakh, the entire Hebrew Bible, also to a certain extent. There are a couple of things that we look for. Number one, and it's not as obvious to many people because it really is based on the Hebrew language rather than on the translation, although some of the translations try to draw attention to this, as there are a lot of play on words. Okay, there's word play, if you will. There's certainly there's poetry, and there are puns, and there are what's the phrase that I'm looking for? There's the recognition that the street language expressions that probably meant something to the people of the time, the vernacular. So that you find several word plays. Again, going back to what I was the experience I was just referring to with Abraham and Isaac going up the side of the mountain, and Isaac says to his dad, "Dad, where are we going? What are we doing?" God will provide for you, my son. Things like that. And then Abraham refers to the place as Adonai Yira'eh, which depending on where you want to put the diacritical and the grammatical marks, could mean that God appeared there, could mean that God will show us what we should do. It could mean God is one to be feared or revered. That's all those kind of word plays, which we don't necessarily catch in the English, although some of the translators in our day have tried to add that into their English translations as well. Um, Another thing that's fairly typical and frequent in the biblical literature would be collected as either redundancies or repetition or parallelism. The same thing might be said 2 or 3 times right in a row, just using different words, different verbs, or changing the order of the sentences, or indeed the same story could be told in different ways, spread out over decades or over generations. But we sometimes we wonder, why is that the case? And I would submit that that's frequently because the story had been handed down from generation many different times in many different ways, and depending on who's listening, one of my favorite lessons, most important lessons from professors in the rabbinic school was, and I'm sure it holds from anybody else who does public speaking, is know your audience, know who you're talking to, and know what their background is, and know how familiar they are with the material. So the same kind of thing holds for the biblical author. And if there was something that needed to be repeated, if there was something that needed to be explained in a different way, they would do that. Or if it's poetic, the style of the poetry was that line A would say it one way, line B would say it another way. Or another example, you might know, let's talk about the 10 Commandments. I think most everybody, as I look at the pictures here of the, I'm going to assume that most people have heard of the 10 Commandments. All right, the 10 Commandments actually appear in the Torah twice. First, in the familiar story of Moses after the children of Israel have crossed the Sea of Reeds, and a month later, then Moses goes up to the top of the mountain. God gives him the 10 Commandments, written on the tablets of stone, 5 on one side, 5 on the other side, etc., etc., etc. He winds up breaking the tablets. The golden calf goes back up, pleads with God. God gives him the tablets and the words once again. And many of you may have even been in a situation where you had to memorize the 10 Commandments. They don't play out with as much importance in Jewish history as they do in other religious communities. But there's the 10 Commandments, and we identify them. But then, 40 years later, or actually 39 years and about 9 months later, Moses getting ready to leave the people and hand over leadership to Joshua. It's now a new population. 99.9% of them are not those who came out of Egypt, but now a new generation. Many of them, most of them, were not at Mount Sinai. They did not hear the original words of the 10 Commandments, or as we call them in Hebrew, the 10 sayings or the 10 statements. And so Moses includes them in his farewell address in that book of Deuteronomy, like I say, which is a repeating, a revision, a rewriting and a reteaching of everything that had gone before. These are different people. They weren't at Sinai. They didn't hear the 10 Commandments the first time. So Moses gives it to them a second time, teaches them a second time. All right? Except, if you happen to know the text, there are changes, some of which are major, some of which are subtle. Now, Moses is now 120 years old, right? It's quite possible that his memory wasn't exact on what the words might have been, trying to quote exactly what was said to him on Mount Sinai, the 39 years and 9 months previously. Or, as a teacher, and those of you who have teaching experience can, I'm sure, relate to this, that you don't necessarily say everything verbatim every single time that you are teaching a particular text or hypothesis or theory or whatever it might be. You adjust your words. If you're in a course, a 101 course, or if you're in a graduate level course, if you're talking to the 9th graders, if you're talking to the 12th graders, they have different experiences by which you hope that they would understand what it is that you're giving to them. So Moses, either intentionally or inadvertently, the words of the 10 Commandments as they appear the second time, they have changed. And again, it may be minor or it may be significant. The two examples. One is that initially in the book of Exodus, the first time that the children of Israel get the 10 Commandments, they are told to remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy, right? Okay. And so the question is, why do they have to remember? Well, they'd never have it before. The Sabbath was something that was new. Slaves didn't get a day off. So they had to remember that now as free people, they had a Sabbath day. But what did that mean? What do you do on the Sabbath? What don't you do on the Sabbath? 39 years and 9 months later, Moses could tell the people not only to remember, but to observe it, because throughout all those years of wandering and the development of the people, they had studied, they had experience, they had developed a particular set of observances for the Sabbath day. So now Moses didn't have to tell the people, remember that there's a Sabbath day. He had to now say, observe the Sabbath day the way that we have developed it. So the verb is different. The commandment is different between Exodus and Deuteronomy. In the first case, it's remember the Sabbath day. In Deuteronomy, it's observe the Sabbath day. Where they're brought together, even in the liturgy that we use on Friday night, Shamor v'zachor b'dibur echad. How does the, I just gave you my explanation of why Moses changed it a little bit, but is God okay with Moses changing the words? Those are divine commandments. Those are divine. So what right does Moses have to change them? And the rabbis answer, especially the mystics answer, Shamor v'zachor b'dibur echad, whether it's remember or whether it's observe, they're said in the same way. They're meant the same. They're meant to be the same way. So Moses is off the hook. Or one more example and try to prove my point. The last of the 10 Commandments is thou, if you like the old translations, thou shalt not covet. Okay? You shall not covet. You shall not covet your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife. You shall not covet your neighbor's house, male or female servant, anything ox or ass or anything belongs to your neighbor, is the 10th commandment from the book of Exodus. Okay. By the time we get to the book of Deuteronomy, Moses, again, teaching the 10 Commandments, says it this way: you shall not covet, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife. Period. Pause. Separate. Neither shall thou covet thy neighbor's household, male, female, slave, ox, ass, anything belongs to them. In other words, the wife is separated from all the rest of the property. What has happened in those 39 years and 9 months of the experience of the Israelites? the women, I mean, again, there are different episodes and different stories here. The women have gone to Moses and saying, hey, we're not comfortable with just being the property of the husband. And Moses remembered that question, that lesson. And so when it came to talking about and teaching the Ten Commandments, he said, there's a difference between coveting or having some kind of a relationship or being attracted to your neighbor's wife, period. It's different than a piece of property, than the ox or the house or the couch or the television or whatever it might be. So again, the Torah recognizes that there is movement, there's progression. I can't always say that it's in a positive way, but there's certainly that there is change that goes along. And they're not troubled by that. It exists, it's accepted, and it's part of this, like I say, redundancy, repetition, parallelism that we can see in the Torah or in the biblical text. There are stories that what happens when one of my favorite stories to teach about when Aaron's sons get too close to the holy sacrificial fire, and they're killed in the moment. Nadav and Abihu, they're killed on the moment. And similarly, when King David is bringing the ark into Jerusalem, when some of the assistants in their religious fervor get too close to the ark, they also are punished. So there's a lesson for each of the generations there. How do we understand it when someone who really shouldn't be approaching the holiest, the most taboo rituals or symbols of our tradition, what's supposed to happen to them? Do they get punished or do they get rewarded, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? Okay. Then just two other things. One is what I would call the ambiguity of the biblical text, which might be, on the one hand, things that we just don't understand. And my level of understanding might be different than any of you who are sitting there who have PhDs in physics or astronomy or whatever, or the medical doctors or whatever. Each of us has our own sense of understanding and expertise and insight, but there are some aspects and some narratives in the story that just are not going to make sense. They're ambiguous, and so I can try, I can relate to it, but ultimately I just can't deal with it. And so we turn the page, or we move on to the next story, and perhaps say, as the rabbis do, next year, Bashana Haba'ah, maybe you'll have a different kind of mental acuity that will allow you to understand this perplexing story or image or use of the verb. Some of you, jumping ahead, some of you know that one of the most famous of all Jewish philosophers, Maimonides, one of his major texts is entitled, in Hebrew, Moreh Nevuchim. It's guide for the perplexed. It's here, let me try to resolve some of these things that you haven't been able to resolve on your own. Reconciling faith and science, for example. So there's that, what I would call there's the recognition in Jewish history and Jewish scholarship and approach to Torah or Bible. There's a recognition that some things will just remain ambiguous and we just cannot understand them. Certain of the mitzvot, certain of the commandments that just don't seem to make sense. You can't wear clothes that are a mixture of linen and flax. You can't do it. It just doesn't make, there's no particular explanation of why that is there. One of the phrases that the rabbis will use to try to make either an allegory or a metaphor out of a particular text is their code word in Hebrew is kivyachol, as it were. Okay, if we could somehow bring this into the human condition, if we could somehow bring this into our own experience, kivyachol, as it were, and that's kind of their excuse, so that they're not saying anything that's blasphemous, they're not saying anything that's heretical, and whatever. So there's that, and then there's also finally that I would throw out is the recognition that in the ancient texts, a lot of what is written and described, we put it under the category, and again, it's a word that the Torah study people are familiar with, of anthropomorphism, okay? Of putting descriptions of God into human form. God was so angry that God's nostrils flared. Okay, is a quote from the Torah. God saved the people with an outstretched right arm. Obviously, the narrator, whoever the redactor at that time, was right-handed, because you can't imagine using a left hand to describe strength. Usually, the right hand describes strength. God shed tears. We don't believe in a God that has the human form, to be able to do those things or have those characteristics necessarily. And then when we start to use English words or Hebrew words, but we start to use human words, the vocabulary that mean one thing to us in whatever generation, and we apply them to God. God's compassion. Well, if God is compassionate, how does God allow such and such to happen? Or if God is merciful, how does God allow such and such to happen? Is how do we understand this? The divine mercy, if God is by definition not human. My best and simple, I apologize to you, my best example of this came home to me in a very, very clear way. Years ago, I was a rabbi in Santa Monica, California, and I was sitting at a restaurant, a deli actually, and I was sitting at a restaurant almost next to Arnold Schwarzenegger. Arnold Schwarzenegger, whose arms, like his arm is almost the size of my waist, right? Maybe not so much nowadays, but then, all right. So, and it occurred to me that we talk of God being strong. Now, is God's strength the same as the word strong, the adjective we would use to describe Arnold Schwarzenegger being able to lift weights or do whatever? Or does God's right arm look like Schwarzenegger's arm? The reality that we need to come to, the real explanation is not that God's arm looks like this, is that we, being human, don't have the correct vocabulary to be able to describe God's strength. We have to fall back on our human experience, whatever it might be. And the experience of a 6-year-old is different than the experience of a 60-year-old. And I said the experience of a PhD might be totally different than someone else's the experience of a wanderer in the desert or a shepherd. The vocabulary that we use is our vocabulary, not God's vocabulary. By definition, that would be not human. Therefore, it has the limitation of what any of us might mean by those terms. So it doesn't mean that we're limiting God when we use anthropomorphic references, when we use human references. It's the only way that we can refer to the physical characteristics or the attributes of God, as it were. Okay, so those are some overriding statements that I wanted to make about Torah. Let's do only one more piece, and then if there are some questions, I'll try to deal with the questions. Torah, whether we're talking about the Sefer Torah, the scroll, or whether we're talking about Torah as all of Jewish teaching. Torah, contrary to what some of the accusations have been throughout the centuries, the Torah does not mean law. There's certainly a lot of literature that implies that, but Torah does not mean law. Those who get to that feeling or that understanding are not basing their concept of Torah on the Jewish/Hebrew understanding of Torah. They're basing it on what happens when the Torah is translated into Greek. The word that Torah, then when it's translated into Greek, takes on the phrase nomos, and nomos really leads more into law rather than Torah. Torah means teaching. Torah means guidance. You know the Hebrew word moreh or morah is a man teacher or a woman teacher. So Torah is instruction, is teaching, is guiding. If you go to Israel, and God willing, we'll all be able to do that again someday soon, and you hire a tour guide, the tour guides now is considered a moreh derech. It used to be a madrich, was more like a counselor or a guide, but now they use the term moreh derech, a teacher of the way. So in that sense, that's what Torah really means, rather than law. In Torah, and again, Torah, we're talking not just the 5 books of Moses, but we're talking of all of Jewish literature. There are several types of law that might be given from God, or might have been developed by the people and then assigned to give authenticity as if it was given by God. And some of these words, you certainly know the word mitzvah, not, oh, he's doing a mitzvah, meaning he's doing a good deed. I don't mean that. I mean mitzvah in the sense of a commandment, that God commanded the children of Israel, or Moses commanded the children of Israel in God's name to do or not to do something. So that's specifically a commandment. And I happen to translate that or interpret that was what I call a life sanctifying act, but that's different. There's also a chok, the Hebrew word chok, which I guess we would translate as statute or ordinance. And then there's the word mishpat, which more relates to judgment or a ruling. Mishpat usually implies that there has been human involvement in rendering the decision. So a shofet is a human judge, although Abraham does say in the Torah portion or the Torah verses the class was talking about last week, Abraham says to God, you're the judge of all humanities. Should you not be doing justly? But a mishpat is also a ruling. So
Rabbi, I can't hear you.
Sure, Lenny, go ahead. Lenny? Lenny, are you
Am I the only one?
I hear you.
Yeah, we can hear you. I can hear you.
Lenny must be the only one. I can hear also.
Yeah. Lenny, can you hear us?
I can hear you too.
Did you go offline?
I can hear you just fine.
Okay. I'm sorry. Lenny, can you hear me or not? Guess not. Okay, we must have lost him. But let me continue, and then we'll do it. So again, the bottom line is that Torah does not mean law. Torah means teaching, and indeed how we interpret the various laws, commandments, statutes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The question, and incidentally, and this is where we'll pick up next week. Incidentally, those mitzvot, those practices, those ordinances, those injunctions, statutes, whatever, are not in any order, and that's the problem. And that's where the rabbis will step in and try to give it some order. So if you wanted to study all the laws about Shabbat, ideally they would be in one particular section of one of the 5 books of Moses, but they're not. They're spread out all over as the people had different experiences, as they moved from place to place, as people asked questions of how do we do this, what do we do, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there's no order, there's no particular process to what's considered a mitzvah, what's considered a chok, what's considered a mishpat, or whatever. The question or the challenge then to the Jews over the centuries is how do we use or how do we follow these teachings, this teaching, the Torah as teaching? Do we follow it blindly? Do we follow it verbatim? Do we follow it liberally? Are we allowed to interpret? And if is each one of us allowed to interpret, or only the rabbis or only the priests allowed to interpret? What does that mean for the process? Some of you may be familiar with, and if you haven't ever read it or seen it, I would advise you, Abraham Joshua Heschel's book, Man's Search for Meaning. That's the best way to understand Torah, as this is our search for meaning, and that all of the Jewish insights that help us deal with our lives can be contained there in Torah. So I'm going to stop there. And just next week, then I can just pick up with one quick summary piece of different themes that are existing in the Torah, and then we'll move on to how the rabbis start interpreting and using the words of Torah, again, not as law, but as guidance for their lives. Deep breath.